Hi, it's only Michael here, and this is the 5th time I've tried to record this whole video, because I'm really bad at YouTube in general. But I'm making this video because I just want to show you my process on drawing in MediBang. I will more than likely split this up into separate videos, this first video focusing on my sketching and lining process. So first thing you want to do is create a new canvas. Usually how you do that is just go up to File and select New, or you can hit Control N to open a new image. It is from here where you can select different options, like how many pixels do you want your width and height to be, the resolution, and you have more understandable options when you hit paper size. You can select MediBang cover art, Twitter image size, header, icons, etc. Just mess around, you find something that works best for you or whatever you're drawing. I usually keep every canvas at MediBang cover art, which has the presets I usually stick by. 2100 by 2800 pixels. These are also reversible, like for instance this preset here is my portrait preset, but if you click this it becomes landscape. I usually do more or less portraits. Anyway, hitting OK opens up a new canvas. This is also where I'll discuss some of the tools. We'll start with the right side. Over here we have your navigator, which you can use to look around on your canvas. Pretty self-explanatory. This is zoom. That resets where you zoom out at. Rotate, resets the rotation. And this is a mirror tool. I'll show you more what that does, but it allows you to flip your canvas to see any imperfections or whatnot. Over here is your layers, where you can create new layers, delete layers, duplicate layers, or even merge layers. For right now we'll focus on just adding a new layer. Moving over to the left side, we have our tools, our brushes, erasers, etc. This here is your color picker, where you can pick your color. I'm just gonna do this very quick because that's what I usually always do. Down here is our brush preview, where you can adjust the size of your brush and its opacity. I usually keep my brushes at like 10 or 15, give or take. 10's usually a good spot. You can also select multiple brushes, like the airbrush tool, a blur tool, pin sharp. I never really use most of the other tools. The tools that I use most are pencil, pen, airbrush, and maybe a couple more. These usually are like the 3 I use most. On topic of the pencil, this is the pencil I use to do my sketching process. I usually have this at like 20, so whenever I am working on a sketch, on digital anyway, I'll use the pencil tool. Also down here, because I almost forgot to bring this up, this is the reference, tab, where you can input a reference of choice, just so it's easy to access. There's not much more I can really state other than to demonstrate, these tools in practice. I'm going to make a sketch, and I'm just going to show you the sketching process. Hey, it's only Michael here, and this is where I'm going to also state different keybinds and such that you will definitely want to learn when using MediBang. Sure, you could always just, click the buttons manually in the program, but I find it a whole lot more convenient and easier to just learn the different keybinds, unless if you've got a tablet that has those buttons on it for different keybinds. Assuming you don't have that, I think it's very convenient just knowing the keybinds of MediBang, and they're pretty easy and basic to understand. First obvious keybind is Control Z. Very easy, basic. most programs follow this rule. Control Z is undo. And with Control Z, you have Control Y, which is redo, which allows you to redo something you didn't mean to undo. After that, we have Control X, which when you have a selected object, you hit Control X and it deletes it completely. Spacebar. You hold spacebar and it makes a little grabby hand on your mouse, and that allows you to move the drawing without marking it. Control T. Control T marks the layer as a movable object, or whatever you have selected as movable. And while you can move it, you can also transform the selected area and stretch it, resize it, etc. There's also Control S. Control S just, saves your project as is, and Control Shift S is save as, where it'll open up a prompt and you can rename your project file or do whatever with it. You mainly use this whenever you're transferring your project file into a PNG file or raster file, whatever file. Yeah, that's basically all the keybinds I actively use. So yeah. Okay, so now that we're done with the sketching layer, we can move on to the line work. You do this on a separate layer, so that once you're done with the sketch layer, you can just take it off and you just have the line work. Make sure that you're drawing on the line work. I cannot stress this enough. One thing I like to do before I start on the line work is take my sketch layer and duplicate it, then take the two sketch layers and merge them together. This makes it more of a bold sketch to work with, so that whenever I lower the opacity, it's all mostly visible and easy for me to see. One brush that I like to use when I'm doing the line work is the pen brush. It's pretty straightforward, and it's basically an average pen, but digitally, obviously. I use it because it's the easiest to understand, but obviously, whenever you're drawing in this program, I encourage you to experiment, maybe even find a better pen to use. If you've got any better pens that you use, I'd love to hear about them. You can leave that stuff in the comments if you'd like. Alright, so now that we're done with the line work, we can make the sketch layer invisible to see what we're working with our line layers. I know it looks a bit basic right now, but that's because I didn't draw the patterns as the line work. How I do it nowadays is I put the patterns in with the color layer. Now we're going to be going over the coloring process. What I like to do first off is take my sketch layer and pull it up here, make it visible, but still make it, you know, transparent. We'll be making this invisible for the time being though. Make a new layer, put it to the bottom, and this will be our color layer. What I like to do next is make a new layer outside of the folder and make it like a gray or something. This just makes it easier for me to see the colors as I go about coloring. This character here is primarily red and orange, so we'll be working with those colors. I don't have a ref made of this character at the moment, so we're going to be color picking from scratch essentially. So getting a color set, I think this will be a good color to work off of. What I usually do, if there's incomplete like spots here, which usually when I draw there would be, but since this is a simple drawing here, I'm not really gonna bother too much about it. I'll probably put a border over it anyway. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna seal the lines up where that meets. Then take my fill bucket tool and I just fill in the lines. Actually, before we do that, I'm gonna make the line work semi-transparent. This allows me to see if there's any spots that I need to go and touch up that aren't filled in, because the paint bucket tool isn't perfect by any means. You have to like use it real. Honestly, I encourage you to use it sparingly, only for like parts like this, but when it comes down to like very specific tiny spots like the hair here for example, you're going to rely more on the brush to go in and fix those details by hand. Like you see here, using the paint bucket tool, you can see these little imperfections here. You'd have to go in with your paintbrush and fix them manually. Now I gotta get a purple color. This character's design mainly consists of reds, oranges, and some purples. Now I've got to pick a color for the orange. Now here's the part where it gets kind of tricky, and here's why I have the sketch layer up here. So that whenever I am working on the little facial designs, you know, designs I did not include in the lining process, is so that I can apply them here directly into the coloring. But before I do that, I'm gonna take off the line work. This tool here, the magic wand tool as I call it, I use this tool and I select a color, and this allows me to just color on that specific area. So now that we have that selected, we can put those layers back and go in and just, you know, have at it. This is the part where I realize that I'm coloring it wrong. This is where the orange goes. I'm so dumb. And so now we have the face pretty much done and colored. You could also do adjustments at this point, however you want to do it. I'm going to do a few more adjustments on the muzzle part. I'm also going to go ahead and color the eyes as well. Now we'll continue with the coloring process, but now with the chest area. I realize now I don't have a set pattern for the chest itself because I don't have a reference made of this character. So I'm just gonna, I guess, improvise here. Okay, so now that we have the color layer pretty much finished, we can go back to the line layer and turn it back to 100% opacity. That way you can see all the line work nicely. At this point you can skim across the drawing itself, make sure there's no gaps or everything is, well, colored in. It is here where we will start preparing for the shading stage, aka probably the most painful part of the drawing experience. To set up a shading layer properly, you want to make a new layer. First of all, name it shading. How I do it is I have multiple shading layers. One shading layer for my cell shading, a second layer for my airbrush shading, and a third layer for the lighting. So we're gonna do cell shading first. So we're gonna name this cell shading actually. And you want to set this shading to clipping, because let me demonstrate very quick. If you do not have clipping on and you get a color out to shade with, the color will just go all over the place. Whereas if you have clipping on, it only colors the area based on the layer that it's on top of. If I have this, say, on top of my line work layer, it would affect the line work. So that's what clipping does. Next, you want to do, when you're shading, you want to go to blending, and in this drop down menu, select multiply. And that is how you shade. Using multiply, it gives, I don't know, the shading, makes it look like it's shading. I don't know a better way to explain it. It's just how it works. So with all that in mind, we will now start the cell shading process. Okay, so now that we've finished the cell shading process, we've got to do this whole process over again, but this time with an airbrush. Create a new layer and set it up as I would a normal shading layer. I'm just gonna call this airbrushing layer, or airbrushing, shading, something. And we're gonna be doing the same process, but with an airbrush tool. This process is actually pretty straightforward. It's a whole lot less of a headache than doing the cell shading. It's just going along the lines. I'm gonna do that now. Now that the airbrush shading is done, another thing that I really like to do to just make the airbrush and the cell shading kind of blend in, before I start adjusting the layer's opacity, I would go in and take them off. Using the same color that I used to shade it, I would take the paint bucket tool, be sure you set it to layer, and then just paint the whole thing. That way, whenever you start tampering around with the opacity for each layer, it all starts to come together. It is here now where we start going into the lighting. The lighting is more or less establishing where the light source is hitting on the face to produce the shadows here. How I usually go about this is how I would go about the shading process, but in reverse. I start by creating a new layer. We'll name this layer lighting, but this lighting way is going to be airbrush. That's not how you spell it, but you know what I'm trying to say. And go to blending, and instead of saying it to multiply, we're going to set it to add. This is where, if we get out our airbrush here, well, no, we'll get out the pen tool just so I can show you what it does. It, behold, lightens it instead of makes it darker. And that's exactly what it does. You can also tamper around with the color this point, because you probably will need to make it brighter anyway, so that it actually looks like a light source. I'm gonna light this now using the airbrush. Okay, so now that we're done with the airbrush lighting, yeah, like I told you, it's really straightforward. I would make another layer again, set it to clipping, set it to add, and this layer is going to be lighting, but you know, cell shading, but with lighting. You know, lighting cell lighting, whatever you want to call it. There's usually not that many areas that I go in and light this way, other than areas like the hair, the eyes, the nose, and maybe the teeth. And maybe some very specific areas I might touch up on, but usually I use this pretty sparingly. And now that the cell lighting is pretty much done, you can now go in here and adjust the opacity till when it best fits. There's still a little bit to do after this point, like color the line work, which we will do now. Coloring the line work is not tricky at all, actually. We first gotta go to the line work layer, this layer here, and we're gonna create a new layer and keep it at normal, but set the clipping layer on so that whenever we select a color that is a little bit darker than the color it's next to, but not pitch black, so it just kind of makes things look more clean. And that's the line work colored. Now there is one tiny detail. Now this detail isn't exactly vital for drawing in general. This is just for this particular situation. The character itself has a silver piercing on his eyebrow. I did not color that in the flat coloring process because piercings have to be shaded a specific way to really look like a piercing. So what I do whenever it comes to that, I make a whole new layer entirely to the point where it's called just piercings. I would classify this as its own line work to give you an idea. He has a silver piercing on his eyebrow. So I start with like a gray base and then I just, where's it placed? Okay, so it's like right there. So I start by creating another layer right above the piercings line work. This will be shading. Now normally I would make a cell shading layer and a airbrushing layer. I'm just going to do both processes in this same layer because it's such a tiny little detail that I don't really think it'd make much of a difference. And there's our shading done. Now I'm going to make another layer, set to add. And there's the piercing done. So now the subject of the drawing is basically done, except for obviously the background. What are we going to do for the background? Honestly, this would have been something I would have done already, probably back in the coloring stage, but I just didn't have any ideas at the time. I'm just going to improvise a background, honestly. Once I'm at this stage, I do a little trick, if you will, to allow the character to pop from the background. Remember how we put everything in this folder? What I like to do is close the folder up and hit Control-C. That copies the whole thing as a separate PNG. Hit Control-V, and there's the whole drawing there. Make this invisible, and hit Protect Alpha. And set my brush size large. and just color the whole thing black. After this, I turn this layer back on, hit Control T to enlarge it or adjust it. I'll do this and kind of shift it back, and this kind of creates a shadow, if you will. I'll go up here to filters and select lens blur to, blur it a bit, and set the opacity to 40 or something, and that allows it to pop. We're essentially at the final stages of putting this whole drawing together. What I do at this point is grab my watermark and place it in one of the corners. Over here, I've actually loaded up the PNG file for my logo. I just go over here, hit Control C, come back, Control V, make sure this is at the top of the layer list. Control T and bring it down here and position it where I want it to be. Hit OK. And if I want to make it, colorful or whatever, I hit New Layer, and I make this layer, or I set this layer to multiply and as a clipping layer. And that's essentially the drawing right there. Make sure you save the project file as is, and then save the PNG file separately. In case there's like a weird mistake, you can just go back, save it as a new PNG file. You can also use this time before going ahead and saving the whole image, go back and do some minor changes, whether it be to the line work or to the shading bits. Like over here, I can do a little bit of touching up on this nose because it looks a little flat. So what I'm going to do is add a new layer and just adjust the nose to where it looks a little less flat. What you can also do is make the line work look a bit more dynamic by adding in some hatching, if you so choose to. That's what I'm going to go ahead and do, just to kind of polish things up. And that was my process in drawing in MediBang Pro. Here's the finished artwork that I have just made. I'm sorry if this video took so long to make. I've literally written this script about 3 or 4 times and tried to record this video 5 times. Just every time that I tried to record this video, when I went to edit it, I just did not like the outcome of it, and that caused me to just kind of put this project off until now, where I'm finally re-recording this again and finally editing it and sending it off to be released. I hope you enjoyed this video, and hopefully my production quality is increased at least a little bit. I'll see you all next time.